Right, well, good morning, everybody, as you file into this wonderful session on AI verification, fact-checking, copyright and media law. My name is Corinne Podger and I manage programs and education at the Walkley Foundation. It's our absolute pleasure to be supporting you with this wonderful series on AI and journalism. At the end of this session, the recording will be uploaded to a dedicated landing page on our site. I'll pop the link to that in the chat box. And I just want to also mention, we do have a Q&A box and a chat box, but actually just use the chat box. You can use it to introduce yourself if you want to, and just let other people know where you're based, where you work, what you're interested in. You can also use it for your questions to our wonderful guests today. So without any further ado, I am going to introduce our wonderful speakers. So our trainer today is Sam Gregory, who is the Executive Director of Witness and is just one of the leading global experts on deepfakes. I've been following Sam for years on how to spot deepfake audio and deepfake video. You will have attended perhaps earlier in this series our sessions on AI and photography and video, and then AI and audio journalism, both of which began to touch on some of the techniques for spotting dodgy content. And then Sam will introduce some more advanced techniques today around OSINT, open source information technology. We are also joined by our wonderful guest speakers, Antonia Rosen and Grant McAvaney from News Corp. Grant is the head of litigation at News Corp, and Antonia is with the working group on AI at News Corp. So I'm so grateful to them for joining. They're not here to give legal advice. They will give us some just general thoughts around the issues relating to copyright and media law that we're all trying to navigate as we go through this journey of this disruptive technology. So Sam, very happy to hand over to you, and I'll keep an eye on the chat box. If there are questions that come up that are immediate, I might pop those to you. Otherwise, we'll have a Q&A at the end as we also come to Grant and Antonia, who will also share a presentation. Okay, over to you, Sam.
Great. Corinne, can you see my screen?
I certainly can, although I can see a tab at the top. That's fine.
Okay.
Yep, looks good.
It's great to be with everyone here. I'm excited to spend this time with you. And I'm going to focus, as Corinne mentioned, on the verification side of AI and deepfakes. So I want to cover 6 areas in the next hour. So we're going to keep this tight. But I want to keep it tight, but also having conversations. So I'm going to encourage people to be really active in the chat box. I'm going to give you opportunities to jump in because we're going to do exercises, and really the way we can interact around them is by you sharing your suggestions, how you'd approach it, and all of those things. So you're going to see that opportunity in the chat, and I'm going to connect the dots as we go along. So I'm going to cover 6 areas today. First, I want to just reground folks in synthetic media capabilities. What I mean by that is, what is actually possible with these tools rather than what is hyperbole, right? So if we're going to start thinking about what we can verify and what we can't, let's start by understanding what the landscape looks like. And I'm going to use the lens of the current omnibus election year globally to do that. Then we're going to jump into a verification exercise. We're going to do that collectively. We're going to look at different ways we might verify a piece of suspect audio to start with, and then a piece of suspect imagery. We're going to look at the uses of technical detection tools, how to evaluate them, what are the ones that are available, what are their pros and cons. Then we'll jump into verification strategy, how to put together a verification strategy that is appropriate to the landscape and to your capabilities. Then we're going to talk about the final bit of this, which is how do you talk to the public about this, right? It's not enough to be able to do the detection. You've also got to explain it to increasingly skeptical publics. And I want to spend some time at the end just talking about the strategies that you've used, as well as what we might want to think of in this new synthetic media era. And then finally, we'll take some time for Q&A at the end. So jumping in with that, let's talk first about synthetic media capabilities in the real world. Now, you've probably heard me say this phrase, synthetic media, like 10 times in the first 3 minutes of this webinar. And I want to explain what I mean by synthetic media. And so I'm going to show this very simple graphic to explain what we're going to talk about today, and to some extent what we're not going to talk about. So synthetic media is the name for creating either wholly synthetic, and by that I mean wholly AI generated images, video, and audio, or potentially manipulated real images, video, and audio that have an AI element in them. And we often talk about deepfakes as an element within this. And deepfakes is a controversial term because for many people, it is only the description of swapping faces. For other people, it has negative connotations because of its origins in use attacking women with non-consensual sexual images. And so broadly, we're going to speak about synthetic media, which is often a subcategory of this bigger category of generative AI, which is a category within AI and machine learning. We're not really going to focus on the underlying technologies here, except to discuss how it makes it harder or easier to verify synthetic media. So I'm going to focus primarily, as I say, on images, audio, and video, not text, and on this sort of subcategory that we're going to call synthetic media. So let me continue grounding you in the space that we're in. So just some key shifts, and these are the shifts that you're seeing in your day-to-day journalistic practice. They're also the shifts that are happening in the news coverage we read of other countries, other contexts. So very obvious, but worth us remembering because they influence the scale and the volume and the accessibility of these tools. Right? So the first thing we should be grounding all of this discussion in is these tools are now available in pretty much any commercial tool, right? You pick a Microsoft tool, an Adobe tool, an open source tool, and you can easily create an image, increasingly create audio, and soon you'll be able to do it with video. And you can do that with what we might describe as volume and variation, i.e., if I wanted to, I could persuade you all to speak to me for a minute on this webinar, and then I could probably falsify each of your voices with that minute of audio. And if I could find sufficient images online by some searching, I could create a realistic image of a realistic scene, including you. We also have what's known as multimodality, which means it's also easier, for example, to write a text sentence and turn it into audio, turn it into images. And increasingly, you can personalize this, and all of this means there are lowered barriers to entry. So this is the landscape we're sitting in. Now, how is this playing out? What are we seeing around us that might make us be concerned as journalists or as others who are engaged in thinking about verification? So I'm going to give you a very whistle-stop intro here. I know this has been talked about in some of the earlier sessions on this Walkley course, but I think just for folks who are joining now or are saying, wait a second, give me the scope of this, I want to make sure we ground in this first. So I'm going to use the elections as a way into this because many people have been talking about this as the AI and elections year. So I also want to ground this in a recognition that there's a lot of hype around deepfakes and synthetic media. And frankly, I've been through, as Corinne mentioned at the start, I've been working in this space for 7, 8 years now. And every election that's happened, every couple of years, there's a hype that this synthetic media will disrupt the election in almost every country that's had it. And I think it's worth us, as we think about verification, being pragmatic about what we're grappling with and its actual prevalence. So what's actually happening? We're 6 months into this year. I'm just giving you a snapshot of what we can see around the world. So the first thing to say, and this is our first takeaway as we enter this verification context, is shallow fakes, by which I mean someone miscontextualizing, misappropriating, lightly editing content are still by far the most common problem when it comes to audiovisual media that is manipulated or misrepresented. And that's really important because some of the things you may know already, and I'm going to come back to this later, like looking for the original, doing a reverse video search, a reverse image search, are still really useful. And most of the content you're going to encounter that is deceptive is a shallow fake or a cheap fake, not a deep fake yet. But what are we seeing? So I always want to start with this and say, AI is being used to target women, right? And this isn't usually a verification challenge. This is a way to target women in the public space with humiliating content and women in the private sphere, women and girls with this content. So here you see examples from Pakistan and Bangladesh. I've, of course, blurred out the images showing women in sexually suggestive clothing or in states of nudity. And we're seeing that escalating in many contexts globally. So this is a significant category of content that may or may not need verification. Sometimes it's blatantly false, but still harmful. Second thing we're seeing, and this represents a category of techniques of AI. And so I'm showing it here, and we're going to come back to an audio example in our exercise in a moment, is we're seeing a lot of use of fake audio. What I mean by that is the ability to take a text and turn it into an audio clip. So I write a sentence in an audio generator and I get a clip from it, or I have a voice clone. I speak into something and it replaces my voice with another voice with the same tonality, with the same cadence or pace. And so examples of that, Biden robocall in the US, where there was a fake robocall representing President Biden's voice. And in Pakistan and many other elections, you've had what are called lip sync dubs, where someone's lips match a fake audio, in this case, an electoral candidate. He went on, and what you see in these two images here, to come out, and this is a perfectly classic way to verify this if you're a challenge a deepfake if you're a public figure. This fake clip came out, the one you see on the left in the middle there, and then he came on and said, "This is not me." But that only works if people trust you and you're a public figure. We're seeing AI for disinformation and impersonation.
Чи весело сьогодні в Москві?
Here's
На
an
мою
example,
думку,
and I'm
дуже
just going to play a
весело.
short clip here,
Хочеться вірити.
where Russian state television showed a video clip in which a senior Ukrainian politician, this man Danilov, appeared to claim responsibility for a terrorist attack in Moscow. And this is a common attack that also targets news outlets, right? They're using a real piece of footage in which Danilov speaks to these news anchors, and then they're replacing the audio with this fake lip sync. And then similarly, on the right, we see these, not a real person, but these fake avatars. It's a completely robotic avatar being used to represent a news anchor, sharing Venezuelan government propaganda as if he was an American news anchor. So it's a completely synthetic avatar. We're also seeing lots of usage. Taiwan is a good example of like just creation of AI images and memes combined with some of these other strategies, like the fake audio, the other settings like this. And then I want to note that this is not all deceptive. A lot of this is very communicative. And the question then is probably not, should you as journalists verify it per se, but how do you talk about explaining the AI process? So two examples here, personalized outreach, where in India, political consultants have been creating these avatars of political candidates who can speak in languages they don't speak, share personalized messages to voters based off voter roles or party affiliate roles, and do that at a scale. And then on the right, you have an example again of audio, in this case of an audio clone speaking the actual words of Imran Khan after the elections there. So he dictated or wrote out a speech and gave it from behind bars because he couldn't give it in real life. Overt political campaigning, again, we've all experienced these AI images, and I know you talked about AI images in journalism in an earlier session. Here we see them being used very explicitly in campaigning on the right. No need to verify this, right? These are like classic, obvious political images. The ones on the right are more complicated. These were created by a candidate in India to represent him meeting constituent groups who he didn't actually meet, like farmers and children. So there is a verification question when it comes to this, even though it is overt political campaigning. And then a final couple of categories just to round out this picture here. We're of course seeing what a number of folks have called soft fakes, which is the ability to essentially humanize a candidate by making an audio clone, say a Prime Minister Modi in India, creating a cuddly avatar of these two presidential candidates, as was in Indonesia, Prabowo and Gibran. They're now the president and vice president-elect. But the problem with this AI image, although it's obvious, you don't need to verify this isn't them, is it's making these two candidates, one of whom is a former general guilty of human rights abuses, look like cuddly grandpa and grandson. And then finally, again from Indonesia, we have what was called a resurrection deepfake, where they resurrected former President
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim.
his current party. Obviously, no one believes
Pada
it's real,
14
but it
Februari
is an existing use.
2024.
So finally, and this gets hard because it's also a scenario in which we have to do verification, we see significant use of AI deepfakes for satire. So, for example, a satirical deepfake of Premier Xi Jinping wishing the citizenry of Taiwan good luck in their elections. Obviously satire, using again these techniques I've been describing of the ability to create lip sync dubbing to make someone's lips match, to create audio clones. And of course, that is very much a weapon of the weak that the powerful detests, right? And the example on the right is how that has been targeted in India. So what I want to emphasize with this is that AI-generated media is being used in a lot of different contexts across a spectrum to attack, to communicate, to deceive, to deny, to humanize, to resurrect, to ridicule. And that verification and detection are not always key to handling this. So does detection mitigate the impact of non-consensual sexual images? Probably not. You've got to have other strategies for talking to your public about that than just, can we detect this as true or false? And then does detection matter for these overtly AI-generated, stylized campaign media? So Again, we're halfway through this year. Maybe you're saying at this point, I'm not too worried as a journalist about this. Is this all smoke and no fire? And what I want to say to you, and I think it's important also because a lot of what journalists need to do now around deepfakes and synthetic media and their detection results is communicate and explain it to the public where we're at and modulate the levels of panic that we might be experiencing in this moment. So keep calm. The sky is not falling yet, but it's yet, right? There are significant technological shifts that make it likely you really do need to be thinking about these problems. So let me move on to that section now. So before I do that, let me just note one other thing, which is, I think it's really important because we're seeing this in a lot of contexts where we work, is people using these claims of AI to deny real content. And they're also using the fact that many journalists and others like election officials don't have the skills to detect AI to dismiss real footage as AI generated. This is an example from a work we've done with groups in India, where the politician who was caught on tape saying some compromising things used as the excuse that it was easy to create AI-generated content. In fact, he referenced a pop culture reference of a song that had been made that appeared to create a duet between Drake and The Weeknd. So a key challenge is protecting trust and validating the real. So our verification exercise. And the way I'm going to ask you to do this is we're going to listen to this audio clip of the AI-generated Biden robocall I mentioned before. And I want you to imagine yourself as a citizen or as a journalist on the day this happened. And I want us to put in the chat how you would verify this content. So please share your ideas in the chat, and I'm going to connect the dots on them, so to speak. So I'm going to play the clip, and then the instruction is, how would you verify this? Put your proposal in the chat. Thank you. So.
It's important that you save your vote for the November election. Voting this Tuesday only enables the Republicans in their quest to elect Donald Trump again.
So, place yourself on the day this came out. What would you do to verify this? Great. Seeing a suggestion there. Transcribe the words, use text search to look for it. Great. Other ideas we'd have here.
It's really tricky, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Contact his media team. By the way, I'm going to comment on these as we go along, and I want to point to some of the things that make these strong. So the text search is really important, right? Because we know that it's very hard to search for audio, right? Think about this, right? You can search for text, you can search for images, you can search for video with reverse video search, but how do you search for audio? So great question there. Contact the campaign, contact his media team, right? So let's check this against the official record, right? Let's check this against the official record. Let's not do this. Sounds like a flaky piece of editing, Denise, there. You're commenting on that. Right, so question here might be, how do you make that decision? What is it that stands out for you that makes you suspicious about this as edited or perhaps AI generated? Okay, and I want to jump in there and say why they're suspicious in this context that it might be edited or AI generated. Okay, so we've got the monotone aspect, right? The sense that it's all the same tone. Second one, you can hear the edits, right? Jerky sound, no flow, monotone, intonation was off, right? So we've got some potential signs here that it might be AI generated or perhaps edited. Okay, so I'm going to move on from this exercise and talk you through what happens when we try and detect this using manual tools. Right, and I love the observation here we've got coming in. AI audio sometimes sounds clunky or disjointed, but it's getting better very fast. And I'm going to come back to this later because what I want to point to there is what we're doing on this is something called glitch analysis. We're trying to work out from the kind of technical signals of the AI whether something's going wrong. We're going to come back to that. Okay, so got a range of suggestions that have come in here, and I'm going to broadly group them in three categories. What you've suggested. First set of suggestions is look for other sources of this online, perhaps by using the text rather than the audio. Second is go to the authoritative source or the original source, the presidential campaign or an authoritative source. And the third is look for glitches or indicators that it's AI generated. So let's run some verification on the audio. And just to mess with us a little bit, I've done the high fidelity version.
It's important that you save your vote for the November election. Voting this Tuesday only enables the Republicans in their quest to elect Donald Trump again.
And then I did a kind of messed up version here.
Your vote for the November election. Voting this Tuesday.
Oh, which seems to have paused. Now this should play.
Only enables the Republicans in their quest to elect Donald Trump again.
So, although it doesn't sound very perceptible, I messed with some of the background noise there. I changed around some of the filters on it. Slightly worse version. Now, what I'm going to show you now is what happens when I place this in a public-facing AI tool. And I'm not particularly picking on this one. It's just one of the ones you'll encounter if you look for it in public, right? So let's have a look at what we see here. Okay, the high fidelity version, it comes through and it says, this is likely human, right? And we know this is not human, right? We definitely know after the fact that this is not human. Re-recorded version, also likely human. Okay, so we have a big problem here with this public-facing tool. It's getting it wrong. Now, let's try it again with another type of tool here, because there's basically two types of detection tools that you're probably looking for in this scenario. So I want to introduce the two types of detection tools. The first type of tool is one that is public-facing, that is designed to work across a range of techniques, that is not necessarily hosted by the company that makes it. A difference here is a classifier. And a classifier is something that's hosted by the company that makes a tool that is designed to detect their product. And so here I'm showing you the results from the classifier produced by a tool called 11 Labs. And about, it's hard to guess, but a high percentage of the audio that is faked is produced by 11 Labs. It's the most prevalent commercial tool. And with this tool, which should be able to detect these audios, what you see is that on the left-hand side with the high fidelity version, and I don't know why their UX is so terrible that it's written in tiny letters, but it says this is likely created by their tool. But if we just mess with it a little bit on the right-hand side, it gets it wrong. It says it's unlikely to be made with their tool. Now, why am I showing you these things? We'll get to that in a second. The reason I'm showing this is to start to plant a seed of doubt in your head as to whether the process here starts with technical verification tools or ends with them as an adjunct to some of the other things we've been discussing, right? So some of the other things we've proposed already in this conversation, official sources, other ways to search and contextualize, maybe they're more relevant as we start this process. Let's try this again with AI imagery. So how would you do verification? I'm going to offer you again 2 AI-generated images. And we're going to stick with images and audio because at the moment they're still more prevalent than video. And it's also easier in this context to really use those for this exercise. So I'm going to show you 2 AI-generated images of former President Trump. I apologize for all the US examples in this context, but these are easy ones that a lot of people are familiar with. And I want, again, you to imagine yourself as a citizen, a civilian or a journalist on the day that you encountered this. What would you do to verify the context? So same question as I asked around the Biden clip. So we've got the one on the left, former President Trump appearing with a group of Black women, former President Trump on the stoop sitting with a group of young Black men. So how would you verify these? What are your suggestions for this? Drop your answers in the chat. Great. So we've got Google image search, TinEye, for those who are not familiar, both of those ways to do a reverse image search on an image that exists already. Check the photo metadata. Excellent suggestion there, right? What does the photo metadata tell us about these? Does it, for example, give us that the details related to a camera? Does it show us the time and date? Does it indicate that a whole batch of photos were created in exactly the same moment? Great. So we've got reverse search. We've got the photo metadata. And now I see folks leaning into what, again, we're calling glitch analysis, right? Check the number of fingers, like how many fingers am I holding up? How many fingers are there on either former President Trump or the other people in the image? Okay. Anyone want to suggest anything else, right? We've got those 3 suggestions here. The reverse image search, i.e. contextualizing it against other images online, photo metadata, digging deeper on this, and glitch analysis. Any other ideas that folks have around this? Okay, So I'm going to jump into how we might think about technical detection on this, as well as those approaches that you've just described. Let's do that glitch analysis. I want to talk a little bit more about this idea that we're starting to play with, and it came up in both of these around glitch analysis. So these are some of the things you might have spotted in this image, right? And glitch analysis can be a really useful part of our strategy. And when we come to verification strategy, I'm going to describe where I think you might want to put your glitch analysis, right? So in this one, let's look at the image on the left. You have often this indistinct line on the hair, or the hair looks slightly off. The hairline can be sort of blended, right? You have the problems with, on the left, you see where former President Trump's hand appears to be on the woman's shoulder. It sort of blends into her skin almost, right? In the backdrop of the left image, AI generators have often created text that is not realistic, right? The text on the person's hat. Again, if we look in the background, there are a number of people whose faces seem to sort of mush into each other, right? So we've got some signs there. On the right there, former President Trump's fingers. I think he does have 6 fingers there for those who are finger counters. Again, the man on the left or on his right, on the left of the image, appears to have that. So we have a bunch of glitches here, but I want to exercise real caution around glitch analysis and flag this to you, right? So I'm unfortunately giving you cautions about 2 big parts of how we're being told we need to think about verification. I've already started to give you cautions on detection. Now I'm going to give you some cautions on glitch analysis. Because, for example, on this screen, you see a lot of the ways that people describe it as being necessary or possible to do glitch analysis. And we've just described them. The hair, maybe an image that's sharp and too polished. Crowd scenes often have problems with people in them. Text, maybe a blurred background that doesn't quite make sense. But, and this came up in the chat, thank you, Tracy, AI is getting better with hands, for example. And I love the image on the left of AI accepting the job from graphic designers with these absurd images. But the image on the right is a screen grab from a year ago. AI generators can get hands right. So don't rely on that, right? And similarly, another thing that comes up, and this is often when I've worked in this space for many years now, and people still come to me in trainings and say, I can spot a deepfake, a face swap, because they don't blink. And the irony here is, I know the person who developed this detection technique that enabled people to spot deepfakes because they didn't appear to blink at a regular rate. And he told me it only took a matter of weeks before someone sent me a deepfake that, guess what, blinked. Because these are just the current algorithmic Achilles heel of the process we're dealing with. So I want you to be very cautious about glitch analysis, also because it plays both ways. So the example I have on screen here is a case I was involved with where you had partisan perspectives on a video of Joe Biden, President Biden, in which some people claimed that the White House was deepfaking him because in this video he appeared not to blink. It was a video he was giving a speech. And it was very clear that this wasn't a deepfake, but people were using the glitch analysis essentially against reality. They were spotting these supposed clues to reinforce their partisan point of view on whether they believed it was necessary for the White House to deepfake President Biden in order to do a public speech. So, okay, we've got a range of solutions we're talking about here. I want to deep dive further into those technical detection tools we're talking about and talk about how you can use these and how to assess them. Because I think that's really the skill I want you to leave with here is not, here's one tool, go with it, use it, because honestly, there's a lot of tools out there and they are changing. And the recommendation I might make today might not be the recommendation I'll make in 6 months. But what I want you to do is have the ability to make good assessments on technical detection so you are able to do that in your journalistic practice moving forward. So I'm going to do some more detection work on those Trump images. And I'm going to do it in a couple of different ways to show you some of the ways these start leaning into each other. And definitely, please put your questions in the chat. I'm going to leave space for Q&A at the end, and I will make sure to come back to those as well if you put them in now. So put them in, and I will make sure I try and get to as many as possible, or pick them up, of course, if they come in as we're going and I can cover them. Okay, so what if we try some detection tools on these Trump images? So let me remind you how detection kind of works in this way. And I'm not going to give you the full range of ways you can do detection. I'm going to talk about the ways in which a large number of the detection tools out there work, which is essentially they take a data set of examples of reality and examples of synthetic reality, and then they find a way to identify specific features and train a model, a detection model, to detect them. And then they give you a confidence score. What I mean by that is it is 80% likely this is a deepfake. It is 70% likely this is synthetic media or manipulated. They give you that confidence score based on the detection results. I'm not going to get into all the detection models here. One thing I'll say is it's a lot easier to protect a known individual because you can develop very specialized detection models for them. And I'll sort of note that later. But in general, you're dealing with this kind of model that is designed for a much more sort of general purpose, right? How do we spot an image or an audio that is being generated either with a particular tool or a range of tools for that process? So let's just use some of the public-facing tools first on those two former President Trump images. So great. Oh, I'm so happy. Folks, I am so happy. Look at this tool. Another example, I'm not particularly picking on the Hive tool. It's one of the ones you can use online. There are links to it in the handout. 99.9% certain that the images are AI generated. This is a very high confidence score. I'm extremely happy, right? Okay. The other one that I've mentioned. Great. I'm going to come to those two questions and pick them up. Thank you. I see those in the chat. Thank you. So first, this is the other one I mentioned I used earlier, AI or not. So yeah, it got it right. It also thought it was not safe for work. I'm not sure why that is with the first image. Then we did something, me and the team at Witness did. We cropped the first image. Remember the image of Trump with the black women. And what happened is it thought it was human. This is a really common problem that we have is when you start to have real world scenarios of manipulating these images, for example, the reduced quality Biden robocall, or editing these images like cropping, perfectly normal photographic act. It's not, there's nothing sinister about cropping an image. We've all done it, right? It can readily confuse a detector. So in this case, this detector, when we cropped it, then said this is likely human. Going to show you another example here. This is a tool that many of you, I hope, use. It's called InVid. It's a great plugin produced by a team in Europe that is really versatile, helps you do a lot of the sort of fact-checking OSINT tools out there. But what I'm pointing to here is when you look at these results here, it comes back and it says, goodness, there's no AI manipulation here. If you look at the one on the left, it says, 10% chance of a face swap, 5%. On the right, it says these ones have been generated with a face swap. Both these results are confusing, but what I particularly want to point to is the one on the left. And this is the problem that a lot of tools work for one way to manipulate an image, but not another. So this is giving us a false negative for face swaps, because of course these aren't face swaps. This is a wholly AI generated image. But of course, if you ran this through this tool and we're not thinking about this, you're going to get this false positive, right? This false, well, I guess in this case, a false negative, excuse me, that says this is not AI generated. And this points to one of the problems we have when we look at AI detection tools is that often they don't generalize. What I mean by generalize is they don't work across a whole range of ways to do synthesis. So they'll work for, say, what's known as a diffusion model. That's often what's used in, say, a tool like Midjourney or DALL-E or some of those other tools we use day by day to make images, but they won't work for something like a generative adversarial network that's used for doing a direct face swap where you take my face and swap it with someone else. Here's another example, and this is a tool that I mentioned in the handout that is created by True Media. It's a really interesting tool they've started to roll out for journalists, and I recommend folks take a look at it. What it does, it gives you a range of results from a range of detection tools. So it gets away from the problem I mentioned before of a single tool that might be designed for one way of creating and detecting AI imagery or audio or video, giving you those false positives and negatives. But it sort of swaps it for another problem, which is how do you make sense of the fact that this is going to give you a false, a positive here, a negative here, a positive here, right? Like this is giving us a range of results because it's using a range of tools. It requires interpretation, right? So again, got this range of problems with AI detection tools that I want you to be thinking about, which is a single tool is never going to be enough. because you're quite likely to get false positives and negatives given the range of ways you can create this media. And if you have an ensemble tool like this, which again, I encourage you to play with, you've got the problem of sorting through which results matter for you. Now, I want to pick up a couple of the questions in the chat, which are there. One question, what are the steps in place to audit and verify the range of detection tools to be robust and workplace ready? The reality is there isn't. There is not a standard for detection that is widely shared in use, particularly for journalists, and there is not a robust external benchmark. There are benchmarks used in some academic and research programs. There are big ones in the US that are developed under the US government aegis, and in the EU context, there are not ones that are specifically public-facing for journalists, and this is a big gap. So thank you for pointing to that gap, the commenter and the question in the chat there. We don't have a range of ways to present what is reliable or not, which is why I'm not pointing to one or the other, because you need the transparency on detection results. And I should also say at the moment, there's a lot of attempt to sell possibly some snake oil in this space. It is a boom area. And so there are not the incentives in place to have full transparency. Other thing I'm going to mention, I'm going to come back to this later to the question in the chat, is also you need to be able to assess these tools against the languages, the accents, and the context you work in. So for example, many tools, if we just got the results for how they'd work on American accented English spoken by guys like me in a faked video or audio, they would likely perform much better on that than they would on someone speaking in accented English, not in English, or from a regional context outside the global north. So, question here around, is it possible? It's currently easier to hear AI deepfake, but if you muddy the background noise, it gets harder. There are tools to isolate the voice. You have to be careful because you can also then mess with the detection, right? Because you're using a tool, you're adding in a layer. I am at this very moment blanking on the tool. I hope it'll jump in my mind, but there's a voice background noise removal tool that we use that you can use for that. But you've just got to be aware that it could mess with your detection results as well. Great. So I'm going to move on to the next stage of this. Thank you for those questions. Keep feeding them in. And I'll come back to this one. This one I'm going to address in the Q&A about authenticity and provenance approaches and their complementarity to what we're talking about here. So before we finalize the conversation in this section, I just want to ask again, and we've sort of been hearing this in the chat, but I want to make sure we're really surfacing the experience from you as practitioners in the field. What are the challenges you're experiencing using AI detection tools for audio, video, and image? And what do you attribute those challenges to? So if you'd like to share a challenge you faced and what you attribute that challenge to, you can attribute it to technical issues, you can attribute it to the platform challenges. I want to just leave that open, but if folks want to jump in, share an observation or a story, I'd love to hear if there are places where this has been happening for you. So I'm going to take a moment just to see if anyone wants to share an example or an anecdote in the chat. Great. Yeah, challenges where to find the most up-to-date. And I think this relates to the auditing and evaluation challenge that I just talked about and that was raised. We really need a better way to understand this and to skill around them. AI-generated images with our stories. I think this is a great example. And I want to talk about that in a second. I'm actually going to come back to that example in a second that is shared in the chat. That's an ethics question, but it's also a kind of a transparency around detection and usage question. Great. Keep dropping them in if there's something that jumps into your mind from your own experience or where you've seen it in others' journalistic practice. Please add it. So again, challenge experienced and to what you attribute that challenge. Thank you. So, okay, I want to recap on the common challenges with detection. And these are what you need to think about. And these are going to be relevant in 6 months or a year too. So as you start to think about what you're going to use here, you need to remember these all the time. So they're only as good as the training data. What I mean by that is they're only as good as the input data that's gone into them. And the practical implication of that is they're going to work less well on less common languages, on accents that have not been included, on people who've not been heavily featured in those training databases. So depending where you're located, you have that inherent disadvantage that is going to come up. So bear that in mind. Second, lack of generalization. They work for one technique to make AI media, but not another. So you've got to use a range of them, or you've got to be really confident of how it was made and that you're dealing with something that is closer to an original. Remember that example around the cropping of an image messed with the results. And I've included in the handout a link to a research article written by some of my colleagues that talks about some of the other ways that just simple edit maneuvers reduce the effectiveness of those AI tools. Right? You've got to communicate that you're communicating a confidence score. What I mean by that is, in general, your expectation, I want to share this with you, is even with good quality media, even with a good range of tools, I don't think we get to more than 85 to 90% certainty and confidence in detection. So you're always going to have to explain to people that there is an element of doubt. This is not a yes, no, it's not a binary. Proving real is even harder than proving synthesized. And I say this from the experience we've had in our work, that often people are like, show me how you know this has been synthesized. And I want to go back to a question that was in the chat that's related to it, which is whether we've seen people trying to put in things like fake metadata or fake, let me just pull it up because it was a little further back. Come across fakes with fake metadata. So what I want to describe is there's two scenarios you need to be aware of here. One is people do, of course, change the metadata, and it's very easy to do that on images, including AI or not. The other is we are starting to see people doing things like running a real image through an AI process to leave traces of AI so that they can then claim that the image is faked. So they can, in a sense, kind of sort of poison the well around a real image and get these contradictory results. So both of those are problems that are starting to happen, and they make point 4 even harder in the context we're in. And then the final one, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, is it's easier to protect and detect public figures than private individuals because you can build personalized models. What I mean by that is you can build a detection model that is designed to detect the real me, the real you, the real Prime Minister X, and that can be used to prove that something has been faked. That really only works for specific individuals where you invest those times and resources. Okay, so I want to pull this together into a verification strategy for you. So this is what I want you to think about as your building blocks. And I'm going to do this because you know the answer to this question already. So when you see this, you're probably going to say, that makes sense. And I hope it does, because what we're doing here is we're trying to build on previous experience. I don't want you to exoticize AI-based verification away from things you may do already and that have been robust journalistic practice before. So jumping in, I want you to start with SIFT or something similar. What I mean by SIFT is this is an example of a media literacy approach where you do these 4 steps, right? And there are other acronyms out here. I use this one in my work, you know, where you're stopping, you're investigating the source, you're finding better or additional coverage, and you're tracing the claims to the original context. And this is basic, both civilian media literacy practice, but also journalistic practice. And it's exactly what you pointed to with the Biden robocall, which is you're like, first of all, let's find out if this actually comes from the source it claims from. Let's also trace it back to its original source by doing things like reverse image search, reverse text search. And let's also try and understand from that whether we should be skeptical about this as faked without even starting to wonder whether it's AI generated. Then I want you to do reverse image search if you haven't done this already, or to do that text search. You do have the limitations that audio is hard to reverse search. This is a big gap on platforms. There is not an easy reverse audio search. And of course, for video, you're going to have to do this frame by frame. And for those who are not familiar, there are tools like the InVid tool I mentioned that enable you to do that sort of frame breakdown if you wanted to search a video to see if there's an original source. Now, this goes to one of the questions that came up about tracing back to the original. Is one of the problems that we encounter around these AI images is when they lose context, they also lose the intention perhaps to deceive versus to illustrate or amuse or disturb. And the reason I'm showing this slide is because the 2 examples I used of former President Trump, neither of them was designed to deceive, right? So our act of verification is really often about an act of deception, right? We think someone is trying to deceive us with the AI images. In this case, they weren't designed to deceive. If we find back the originals on these, if we trace them back, we find, to the question in the chat, that the one on the left was created as illustration by a right-wing journalist who wanted to illustrate, in this case, a story about the support for former President Trump in the Black community in the US. And he illustrated his story with this image to illustrate what he perceived to be a strong level of support from Black women from former President Trump. But it became misconstrued as deception. And the right-hand image was actually created as satire. It was created for a satirical site to satirize former President Trump's perceived lack of support with young Black men, right? And I think this is really important, and it goes to this question of when verification matters and how to understand context in order to explain it to audiences. Again, the same questions, whether it's important to verify on those campaign images, on those non-consensual sexual images. So here's your basic synthetic media approach I want to emphasize for you. This is your 4-step recommendation from me at this point in the process. Start with SIFT or a similar media literacy grounded approach that includes things like reverse image and media search, tracing the original, going to authoritative sources, all the things that everyone on this webinar, I'm sure, is very familiar with. Then do the glitch analysis. That's going to vary by media format, right? We looked at audio, right? The kind of lack of naturality, the way, because often this is going from text to audio, that in fact doesn't have the ums and ahs that we have in textual speech, might still sound a bit monotonic. In images, those signs we named around the glitch analysis, and look at the metadata. And on the metadata, you might be looking for things like the absence of camera data. You'll be looking for the fact that a batch of images was all created in the same moment. You'll be looking for a set of timestamps from the same instant if someone has not changed it. Now, again, the warning on glitch analysis, this changes fast. So your glitches that you might have spotted a year ago are not the relevant glitches now. And I really don't want to encourage you to train the public to spot these glitches, because they will remember these tips even when they are long since irrelevant. Then you might want to take a more advanced OSINT approach. What I mean by that is you can deploy some of the tools that have been developed in the journalistic community. Great, Tracy has dropped a reference in the chat. Thank you, Tracy. Of doing comparative search for similar images, right? If it's an event image that has been faked, probably it's got other images. I'll give you a good example. There was a fake image of the Pentagon fire last year that claimed to show the Pentagon on fire. And my first instinct when I saw the fake image was not to look for the glitches. It was to say, if the Pentagon is on fire, lots of other people have photos and videos of it. There is not just one, right? So we can do comparative analysis of multiple photos and videos. And then I want you to use these detection tools as a reference point with a strong awareness of their deficiencies. Use the ensemble tools like truemedia.org. Use them with an understanding of the problems around generalization, the problems around training data, the problems around assessing whether they are the right tool, but use them as a complement to these other approaches. A few other tips: always try to get the highest quality, most original version of the content. Consider separating the audio, visual, video, and analyzing them separately. Keep up with what's actually possible in synthesis, right? It's still not possible right now to do really complex videos of actual scenes, but maybe it will be in a year's time or 18 months. Keep up with detection, and hopefully soon we'll have these auditing processes that were raised by Corinne and others on the chat, but assume 85 to 90% maximum accuracy. Don't make the detection result the centerpiece, but a supporting element, particularly when you're using public-facing tools where you don't have transparency on their accuracy, and you know that often they're unreliable in these contexts. So finally, sharing verification results. And I want us just to take a moment to think about how we might communicate based on all the things I've just been talking about. So sharing verification results, right? Think about the things that we've just described, right? You've got detection as an element, maybe up to 85 to 90% accuracy. That's your confidence score. You've got the glitch analysis, you've got the metadata, you've got those classic journalistic skills. So think back to these results we've reviewed in the verification exercises. Now, share some ideas in the chat. How would you share these results? How are we communicating around this? Because detection in the absence of communication to our publics is ineffective. And you can see this in the real world. People dismiss on the basis of their partisan viewpoint, or they are skeptical of science communication. So I'd love to hear from you some ideas about how you've tried to do this, how you've tried to communicate around these types of AI detection results, or how you'd try and do this in an ideal world. So let's just crowdsource some of our ideas around how we share verification results. Again, I'm going to connect the dots. So jump in the chat and share an idea if you have one or an experience you'd like to share here. Great, and another resource dropped into that, the verification handbook. I wrote the chapter in that on deepfake detection. It is due for an update. And I know that Craig Silverman, who's also been working on that, has been working on an update there. Great, yeah, great question. Do people want the behind the scenes? Has anyone had experiences of really trying to bring people into the behind the scenes, and if that's worked?
I'll just chip in while we're waiting for folks to comment there, Sam. I posted into the chat about this, but I think it's just worth drawing out a little bit. In the AI and photography and video session that we ran earlier this year, we had Nikki Catley from Australian Geographic on the session. I'll post the link to the story that she mentioned, but they published a story about the ethics of AI in photography with an AI-generated image in it. And the feedback from the audience was just universally negative. So just not wanting to see the image, not trusting the image. And I think it's fair to say that, you know, in the nuances of that, there was a question, I suppose, that it raised and should raise, I guess, for newsrooms in general, does using content and showing that it's been verified or that it's AI generated for the purposes of an illustration undermine trust, no matter what. So that was an interesting bit of feedback.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of feedback. And we've encountered similar issues around this. The core principles, I go back to this, are around consent, disclosure, and transparency, right? So consent, of course, if this is real people. Disclosure, if we're talking about the need to explain it in the given context, right? We have different expectations for a nature documentary, from a drama, from a news item. And then transparency on process. There is a great resource, and I'll try and drop the link in it when I have a chance, work done by the Partnership on AI that builds out a synthetic media code of conduct that includes work from the BBC, CBC, others. And recently there was a series of case studies that explored news organizations' decisions around to have that transparency around use of AI in their production. So I'll make sure to drop a reference there in the chat later so folks have that, because I think it's a really good framework, and also news organizations' lived experience of trying to implement it.
And I'll pass, thanks, Sam, and I'll pass back to the chat box. There's a question there. The picture was from YouTube. Is there AI in that, please?
The picture from YouTube. Sorry, I'm not sure which one that was. Sorry.
Janice, do you want to be a little bit more specific in the question, just the one that you're referring to? And any other feedback from folks as to the sorts of elements from the results, the questions that Sam has posted on the screen there? If anyone would like to comment on how they might approach that, that would be wonderful. I'll hop back out of the chat and back to you, Sam.
Thank you, Corinne, adding that in. So there's no golden rule around this. So I'm not going to try and give you like, this is how you should communicate to your public around AI detection. But what I want to emphasize here is, I think, again, let's really ground this in existing ways your public is going to trust the information. And I think it's really important to think around how you disclose and explain how you did it without luring people into a false sense of security. So I really want to discourage centering your explanation on glitch analysis as like something that's durable. So again, what you might want to do is really walk people through this process, right? We looked for the original source. We went back to the campaign or the politician. We then did this glitch analysis, but we want to remind you this is going to change over time. We then use these AI tools, and we want to emphasize we chose the best tools and we got to this confidence based on this collection of results. This is why we're presenting this information to you. So really want to encourage to try and do this as much as possible. So I'm going to move into the Q&A because I want to wrap us up in the next 4 to 5 minutes. And I've been trying to pick up the Q&A as we go a little more dynamically. So as we go forward, just a few things just to remind you as we look ahead to what might be shifting in the landscape so that you know what to be worried about in a year's time when you start to think about applying these principles. We are going to get an increasing ease of creation, tailoring, and realism. We'll get more videos, that's very clearly. And of course, we're going to get more personalized content that may never make it to the news radar, but may be being used to influence publics who are your audiences, your country mates, citizens in the context where you work. And we really don't know this impact on our ecosystem, information ecosystem. So just thinking big picture, you know, things that as journalists we should be concerned about in this space is what are the impacts of this increased volume of this content, its increased persuasiveness, its increased localization, and how do we understand its relation to an overall problem of declining trust? So those are things to think about in a bigger picture around this content as you start to think about how to prepare your publics. So moving into the final Q&A, I'm going to pick up the ones I see in the chat, and I'm going to just sweep back. So folks, give me a moment just to look back.
There was a question, I can help you there, Sam.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah,
There was a little bit more of a expansion on the question around YouTube.
Yeah.
It's, looking up things on YouTube and wondering what AI impact, what does the AI impact there? So I suppose, is there an AI impact around YouTube search or?
Yeah, I think the problem we should think about there is kind of the synthetic slop problem, that it's incredibly easy to create AI generated content now. And a lot of YouTube content, as we encounter also with Facebook image content, right? All the AI image content you'll encounter in your Facebook feed, is that it is slurry or slop. People have taken to calling it synthetic slop that makes it harder to find reliable information, particularly with videos. I saw a great question here on what are known as content authenticity and provenance infrastructure. That's things like the C2PA. And that's a great question because I think as you look ahead, these are not separate concepts, right? At the moment, most information doesn't have these kind of indicators, typically contained in the metadata, but linked to some kind of robust watermark or secondary signal that enable you to know that something was made with AI, or the sort of recipe of how AI and human were combined. It's being rolled out by all the major platforms. It's not super useful right now, but it's getting useful, and you're going to have that as an element. So if we were approaching this in 6 months, I would probably say to you, look for the embedded signals that have been left by the tool and then complement the two. The problem there is, and this is what we see in the wild, is of course, if someone is doing this maliciously, they're going to try and mess with those signals, they're going to strip them out. So you need to combine detection approaches with these kinds of ways in which you look for the structured information that is embedded by the AI tools that someone who's not being malicious or deceptive will probably leave in.
I think the other sort of field of questions, perhaps, and we'll just come to that question on blockchain in a moment, is around editorial policies. So some of the things that you're talking about speak to risk management, editorial guardrails within news organizations, and also what's communicated externally. I mean, you do this a lot. So what are some of the perhaps principles that news outlets need to think about when they're developing those editorial policies and guardrails?
Yeah, so, one, and I think this is there's a range of ways, obviously, we think about AI content production. I think you need to set your parameters about when you can go with confidence around a verification score and a confidence score. And I think news outlets need to really do that well because the detection tools are not, right? If we go back to those examples before, likely human, what does that mean? Does that mean it's 60% likely, 70% likely, 80% likely, 90, 95, 99.9? So I think it's really important to be transparent and say, we will share our confidence in this, and in general, we will explain a result and include some reliance on it when we reach that stage. So I think that's really important. I think the second is important to lean into that transparency and the imperfection of it. I don't think this is a place for news outlets to kind of sort of pretend that this works perfectly. That's the job of startups and companies to try and sell their product. The job of news outlets is to have really clear editorial guidelines for transparency about when they'll explain that something is credible according to a verification role, and to be transparent about it at this point in time.
Fantastic. We've got two very technical questions. So one is there an AI prompt for an AI co-pilot to run a scan of an image, video, or article to verify, to give an estimate as to validity or an item discussed?
So this is a really interesting experiment that a lot of people have been trying, is like, can we use, take your preferred large language model or chatbot? Can we use it to do verification? And I've seen in the wild people doing this. Actually, we did a lot of work with groups in Sudan who are trying to verify footage there. And it's amazing. People are constantly dropping stuff into chatbots to see. The problem is you're handing over into the black box of the chatbot that kind of question of another black box. So it's sort of like you're layering two black boxes on top of each other. I would do it. Like, I don't think there's a standard prompt I would use, right? But I think it's worth trying, right? I just would recognize that you're layering those two black box problems on top of each other, and to be aware of that. Okay, and I know I'm going to wrap up in the next minute or two, Corinne, to make sure there's space for the others. But should I pick up a couple more?
There's another one. Is blockchain authentication still a viable tool to ensure the provenance of material?
I think that I wouldn't link it to blockchain per se, right? What I would say is, like, there's a lot of value in thinking of ways to retain a durable record of what an image looks like at a particular moment. That could be in a controlled database, it could be in a blockchain. The thing to think about with AI generated imagery is not to think about it as binary. Like, a lot of our production processes are going to incorporate AI. So it's not really about, do we have like a canonical record of the real? It's really also how do we track across time? And you could track those changes in blockchain. I'm just not always sure you need to do that yet, right? There might be other ways to do that. So be able to track and refer back, absolutely. Again, absolutely bearing in mind a bunch of other things we might want to think about, like we want to respect privacy. You should not be tracking like individual creators using this, but yes, tracking changes, the how of how AI was used. Blockchain can be a part of that.
Fantastic, thank you. There's lots of other very rich resource and thought sharing going on in the chat. So folks, if it's of interest, there's a little paper icon in the bottom of the chat box. And if you click on that, it should download a copy of the chat to your computer. And also I'll work my way back through it and include resources that have been shared in the handout for this session. Sam, I'm going to thank you so much for your presentation. By all means, keep those questions coming, friends. Sam's going to stay on the call. I have great pleasure now in welcoming, and actually, Sam, if you wouldn't mind stopping sharing, so that Grant and Antonia can share, in welcoming Grant McAvaney and Antonia Rosen from News Corp. So Grant is the head of litigation at News Corp. He was previously head of litigation at the ABC, so he brings a lot of experience to thinking about the media law side of these things. And Antonia Rosen, who's with the legal counsel team at News Corp and on the working group on AI there. So I'm going to hand over to them. They've put together a presentation to talk about media law and copyright in general terms. And then we'll also take some questions from them. And I know there are a few in the chat. Over to you, Grant and Antonia. Thanks so much.
I was just going to say I've bored myself with so many presentations in the last few years, partly because you have to do a compulsory 10 hours every year to keep your practicing certificate. And Sam, that was one of the most helpful sessions I've been to in a long time. So I've learned a lot. Some say you can catch people's attention by beginning any presentation with an act of humility. I'm going to go one further and start with something that might actually have you second guessing whether anything I have to say is going to be accurate or helpful at all. And it's for this reason. I remember many years ago, around 2007, 2008, being asked by a media client to prepare a memo about the legal issues on this new fancy thing called Facebook. I honestly hope I never see that memo again. I'm fairly sure from what I can remember that I got many things wrong. It's not that I got the law wrong, it's that with any change in technology, the communication changes. And I think until you're in the middle of the party and you know what's actually happening, it's very hard to know how some of this will pan out. So a lot of this is guesswork. If I had time, I'd play you this clip that I really like of David Bowie talking about the internet when it was becoming a thing. And the interviewer suggested it was a tool for people to use. And Bowie enthusiastically says, no, it's not. It's an alien life form. And it kind of always stuck in my head. And I think, if anything, think about what AI is when it comes to an alien life form. I think it's the internet times 1,000. And the party hasn't really started yet. So we've got to learn. We've got a lot to learn. Now, you're not going to leave this session knowing everything about how media law might influence the world of AI. All I think we can really do is I want to give you some really high-level stuff. I know that there's a variety of people here from small organizations, large organizations, a few people who work for themselves. So getting big headlines is about the best thing we can do. I'm going to give you a bit of text in slides, but you will get these later. So please don't scribble down or bother screenshotting or anything unless you really feel that's necessary. You'll get all of this stuff. I just want to give you enough information so that you can ask the right questions. The other thing I just wanted to make clear is that none of this is actually new law. So just get out of your head that there's going to be new law around AI. Maybe that will happen, but think of the law as this slow moving blob that you might see in a Stephen King movie. Okay, so it's this slow moving blob. It's not just going to change. It's not just going to adapt and be modern. Rather, we're going to have all of these examples relating to AI as they hit the courts, and they're already hitting the courts, kind of squished into this existing legal obligation. So judges aren't going to be writing new law for AI. So there's going to be a lot to learn as we go for the party. So remember the old, don't forget the old. If you're a Game of Thrones fan, I like to think we'll need to worship the old and the new gods, and we're going to worship both of those gods today. So there's always going to be an unknown. Prepare yourself for that, emotionally speaking, but embrace ongoing education about it, because I think there's so many sessions at the moment. Some are better than others. And Sam, I think, is the best session I've seen so far. So keep doing that. And if I forget to give you any other advice as I talk for the next few minutes, just remember this. Please read all terms and conditions. I think that's something else I want you to take away. If you use an AI-based program, read the terms and conditions so you know how it will affect you. If you're in a contractual relationship with someone, have a look at the terms and conditions and think how it might affect things when it comes to AI. So we'll get stuck into it. So let's get straight to the point. So in copyright, what I've set out is the things you need to get copyright in Australia and really around the world. So you need a real human author who's created an original work. When we talk about that, we mean that they have to have used some independent intellectual effort and that it's been reduced to a form protected by the Copyright Act. That's really just a reminder of ideas aren't protected by copyright. It's the things you create, the literary work, the artistic work, the film, whatever it might be. So that's the law. Let's see what the old gods teach us and then come back to what might happen in the new gods world. I suspect most of the people attending today have been to copyright sessions where they talk about the famous monkey case. The gist of the monkey case is the monkey grabbed the camera from the photographer. The monkey took his own selfie. The photographer had nothing to do with it. The photographer sought copyright protection in the photo, and the courts found, no, the person wasn't the creator, wasn't the author, it was the monkey. So if anyone owns copyright, it's the monkey. Now, the monkey can't actually own copyright, but it's the point. There's got to be an author in some way. So think about how that might come into play when it gets to the AI sphere. Certainly human creators can use tools, okay? That makes sense. You're a journalist, use a Word document to spell check something, that's fine. It doesn't mean that your literary work's going to lose copyright protection. A painter's going to use a brush, a sculptor might use a chisel, whatever it might be. But when you use AI, and depending on how you use it, it may be that the human involvement, and coming back to that question of whether there's been some creative effort, kind of almost disappears. If it's really the AI that's doing the creative effort, then the human author isn't, and then the human doesn't have anything that they're creating to which will get copyright protection. So that's something to keep in mind. And you just want to think about that in when you are producing content, and just have that at the back of your mind and think, will that affect anything I'm doing on the creator side? So the US Copyright Office, actually, and you might know the US, you don't have to register copyright in Australia. In the US, they have a copyright registration scheme. And the US Copyright Office actually said last year that they don't think much by way of AI generated content will actually attract copyright protection in the US. Now, that's easy said than done, but of course, a lot of weird and wacky examples are going to arise. So here's an Instagram account I enjoy, which is probably an insight into my head. And don't worry, no one's sadder about that than me. But this is called the Forbidden Toys. And basically its whole shtick is using AI to generate pretend children's toys. Usually they're very inappropriate. There's a lot of dark humor, etc. There's a couple of examples on the screen. So I would actually love to know. So first blush, you might think, okay, well, if someone has just put in, I don't know, goes to a program, puts in, make fake confession toy in pink with a religious person getting confession, something like that. Okay, it's not going to be very hard to find or reach the conclusion that there's actually no human author. There's not enough creative effort for copyright protection to kick into play. But you're going to have to ask a little bit more than that. What we would actually need to know, and I don't know the answer, is the creator of this page, how much effort are they putting in? Are they spending hours tinkering with the terms that they put in? Are they doing research to work out how to get, for example, the best cool confessions picture? If that's the case, then I think you're starting to get to the sphere that there has been sufficient creative effort and copyright protection might come into play. This picture is called The Next Rembrandt, and it was actually well, even if you're not an art aficionado, you can probably tell that it's in Rembrandt style. It's AI created. It gets used a lot, and I've seen it used in various reports and articles on this topic where authors have suggested, look, it's produced by AI. Obviously, Rembrandt paintings are so old, they're not going to have any copyright protection. So any picture produced in this style by an AI program isn't going to get copyright protection. But I just want to keep this in mind. So there is a countervailing position on that, and it's a very influential one. So if you're ever looking for one of the leaders in legal expertise on this, it's Jane Ginsberg, who is a professor in the US and one of the leading copyright experts in the world, considered one of the leading copyright experts in the world. Also Ruth Bader Ginsburg's daughter, just for a fun fact. But she's actually argued with a co-author in one of her papers that it's actually an example of a machine-enabled work through a collaboration, where there was a collaboration with the designers of the machine and the programs they use, and the people who then use the machine to get the specific result. So whether you're producing pictures, videos, images, written content, if you want to think, okay, and you want to be confident there's going to be copyright protection in it, you need to think on the facts of this case, is there sufficient creative effort? It will depend on the facts. So you want to keep that in mind when assessing anything. There are some other examples around the place if you want to look at, there was a band, I think it was an Aussie band, Uncanny Valley, used AI to generate the song Beautiful the World, which won the Eurovision style AI song contest in 2020. Would it get the protection of copyright? I'm not entirely sure. It depends on how much work is done behind the scenes. It's not going to be a yes or no answer. I didn't know this because I'm uncool, but Antonia's far more relevant and told me about Grimes, who she broke up with Elon Musk.
Yes.
Well, when did that happen?
I cannot tell the specific date.
That's disappointing.
Well, they're on and off. I don't know. They might be.
Right. Okay. Look, she musician, she embraced AI, said she would allow to produce some songs, and said she would allow her voice to make song if you could split the royalties 50-50. Of course, the flip side is she may not be entitled to any royalties depending on whether or not there's a creative process. So there's always going to be things to keep in mind. So keep that in mind on the creator side. Now I want to flip to the user side. So you want to use someone's content, what could happen? The slide sets out a few things. All of them could be an hour lecture in themselves, so I won't go into it. So I'll leave you to read them in your own time. But I suppose here are some things to think about when it comes to using someone else's content in the AI world. AI doesn't operate in a vacuum. It literally comes from human experience and things that have been produced by humans in the past. So depending on the process you use, you may very well be, as part of that process, substantially reproducing the content protected by copyright of someone else. Maybe no one will know that you've done that, if there's no transparency or it's not obvious from the end product, but it's certainly a risk you run. So when we get to particularly the world of scraping, getting lots of information, databases, whatever it might be, and producing something different, if as part of that process you are substantially reproducing someone else's content, then you run a risk of breaching copyright yourself as the user. There are going to be other issues that will arise. So in Australia, we have a series of fair dealing defences. Usually, most of the fair dealing defences require attribution. There are some outliers there, but then there's a school of thought that usually for something to be fair, you probably have to attribute who the original creator is. Just to complicate things, creators also have moral rights in Australia, which include the right to be attributed to as the author of a work. So if you're scraping and substantially reproducing masses of work, how on earth do you attribute? So even if you think there might be a defense, if you actually look at some of the, legal details around it, it's going to be easier said than done. That's the annoying thing. I'll also leave you to look at this slide later, but just a few points on the technical side as well, remember that the software coding itself is protected by copyright, but usually the output isn't. So if you're a programmer, if you're someone on the programming side, or you may have copyright, and it's weird. It's because the Copyright Act has been patched up over the years as technology changes. So there's this weird thing where software is essentially defined as a literary work. But you may have copyright in the program, doesn't mean you have copyright in the ultimate product that comes in. I've talked about scraping, and I think that's otherwise the main thing. And one point I just wanted to make there before we move on is that I think there is a perception around, you can imagine the kind of news content that you might want to produce where you are looking at, you know, it could be anything from assessing financial data that someone else has put out. You know, there's rankings around the place of schools, all sorts of things. Think about it. You might think, oh, I'm just using information that they've got on their website. That's no problem, but it could be. And it could be because a database, so the way information is actually set out, is itself protected as under copyright as well. So again, you might just think you're taking info. It very well may be a literary work, and you're breaching the copyright. You know. And can I also make this point? Copyright is always subject to the contract. So, for example, you may use, I don't know, I can't speak to this. You may use an AI-based program. The terms and conditions could be such, theoretically, that if you use it, that you are accepting that they own the output of it, so you lose your copyright entirely. Or, and this is often more common around the place, is that you're giving the owner or operator or the software developer a license to use it. So you may have the copyright in it, but you may be legally giving them permission to use it however they want. So keep that in mind. It's the same thing when you're preparing content for others. Always read your terms and conditions, look at your agreement, because the general principles of contract are always subject to contractual provisions. For example, a contractual provision may say you can access our material lawfully, but you do so on the basis that you will not rely on a fair dealing defence. So I just want to keep that in. Easier said than done, but something to put in the back of your head and consult with lawyers if needs be. I'm talking too long, so I'll go really quick. I suppose the other legal issues are if you're using anything AI-based to produce stories, can I just say you need to think about how are you going to make sure that the other relevant laws are complied with. If you're producing a court report, I've not ever seen this done anywhere, but if you're producing a court report, is it going to comply with statutory restrictions? How is it going to know about suppression orders? Is it going to understand contempt laws if a trial is going to take place next week? I think at the moment there needs to be some human intervention. And quite frankly, I hope that they don't put all of the media law knowledge into a program anytime soon, because I've got a little while to go before I retire. So I really need to remain relevant for a while. Another thing to keep in mind is, look, it's not really my area of expertise, but you'll know generally that certain corporations of a particular size have privacy principles they have to comply with. Includes coming down to use, collection, storage. You will know when you've signed up for just about any media's website that there's usually some privacy obligations, or sorry, privacy agreement that you're signing up to. Same with the social media giants. You could be, if you're the person signing up to them, you could be giving permission to use your private information. But if you're collecting that information or using someone else's information, you could, if the privacy principles apply, be in real trouble. And I guess, what have I got? Just the last couple of things to think about is, I mean, Sam's presentation, some of the things that pop up there kind of frighten me from a defamation perspective. You know, it used to just be as simple as getting documents. You'd send copies of documents to the other side. But as we head down a world where you're looking, how am I going to prove the truth of something if I don't even know whether it's true? It could be an issue. I'd also say this for the journos, probably any journo on this call, probably other people as well, watched the Lerman trial. For those, you will have seen how the courts assess a qualified privilege defence, which requires journalists and media organisations to prove they acted reasonably in the circumstances. Now, what if it turns out that something is forged that you rely on or that you collected? I can actually see a situation where you could spend days in court arguing about why you relied on it. Did you do the kinds of checks that Sam's spoken about today? all sorts of stuff. So all sorts of issues there. And I mean, look, this happened with, I think this was a News Corp publication, but many years ago. This wasn't AI produced. People got confused and thought these actually were photographs of a almost naked Pauline Hanson, and they weren't, and trouble ensued as a result. So imagine how that might play out in the AI world. So keep that in mind. Obviously, I won't go into it, but you can. What worries me is that when things happen in a fast-paced newsroom, things like the Georgie Purcell situation can happen, where AI has somehow transformed a photograph of her, increased the breast size, and introduced midriff. That's more of a moral issue than a legal issue, but it's something to keep in mind. Obviously, think about how your organisation may use AI for its benefit. That could be, in particular, trying to take out defamatory comments on web posts and things like that. And the last thing I'd say, and I'm sorry I've spoken so long, is just on ethics. It's not just the strict legal position here. One or all of you will be bound by ethical obligations, practice guidelines, codes of conduct, and think about how some of the things like this will feed into some of the requirements there, particularly around transparency. I should just say, I had a look when the singularity is going to happen. For those who don't know, the singularity is where some experts think that computers are going to overtake the world because we've made them too powerful. Quick look up last night says earliest 2031, latest about 2050. So maybe this is just a waste of time and we should just get comfortable with worshipping our computer overlords. So I'll leave that thought with you.
I'll run through quickly because I know we're almost at time, but I am going to talk about a couple of the deals that are going on. I should stress that I'm talking very much from a general perspective about things that are publicly out there. So this really does follow on from a lot of what Grant was discussing in the copyright sense, because I think that has really, it's the unspoken thing that underlies a lot of these deals that are going on. And also it's very much the spoken thing that is happening in terms of the litigation. And really, it comes from something that Sam actually picked up on or talked about in his presentation, which is that the accuracy of these models and the improvement of the accuracy of these models is directly correlated to the amount of data that they're trained on and the amount of parameters that they have. And the parameters are ascertained by training a large amount of data through something called a GPU or multiple GPUs. It's a very expensive process, costs millions of dollars and can take days at a time. And as a result of training the data or running the data through the GPUs, you get these parameters. And early versions of the models were trained on data scraped from the internet. And there were models that have been subsequently released and they get better each time. And now there is sort of a land grab for the best quality data to improve these models. And there has been discussion amongst these companies and in Silicon Valley about creating synthetic data, which is computer-generated data to train these models. And there is evidence to suggest that actually computer-generated data can make the models worse, or as the Washington Post referred to it, computer inbreeding. So
very Game of Thrones.
Very Game of Thrones. So so human-generated data is actually very valuable in this sense. And that's really been the basis for a lot of the negotiations that content creators or companies and organizations that own the copyright in these content are having with the organizations and companies that own these models. And so some of the deals that have been happening, and there have been quite a few that have happened, the Associated Press had one with OpenAI in the middle of last year. There was a German company called Axel Springer that had one with OpenAI as well. They own Politico and Business Insider. Thomson Reuters has engaged in a deal with OpenAI, and obviously quite publicly News Corp as well. And I guess the reasoning behind some of these deals, again, speaking very much from a general perspective, is that one could imagine that at a certain point, and I don't think we're anywhere near that, but they could develop ways to improve these systems without human-generated content or content the subject of copyright. But also it's possible that organizations and companies that own models that in other jurisdictions that don't respect copyright could just go ahead and do this. So the commercial and practical realities of doing a deal in a jurisdiction where they do respect copyright is obvious there. The other point, and probably one of the big ones, is that litigating the issue is expensive, it's protracted, and it's unpredictable. And an example of where it's gone wrong previously is the Google Books case, where the Authors Guild in the US took Google through the court system, the US court system, because Google had basically digitized books and allowed excerpts of the books to be visible on the internet. And basically, it went all the way to the Supreme Court, who refused their petition for the case to be heard, and it found in favor of Google. So companies who are suing aren't necessarily guaranteed to be successful in their pursuit. I'm really conscious of the time, so I'll just quickly run through some of the cases that are happening very, very quickly. So the biggest one that has hit the courts for present purposes and in recent times is the New York Times, who's suing OpenAI and Microsoft. And they're basically claiming that OpenAI trained on millions of their articles. They're seeking billions in statutory damages. They're also seeking the destruction of any chatbot that's being trained on their data. And as you can see here, and this comes straight from the documents that the New York Times has filed with the courts, you can type into ChatGPT, or I think probably one of their lawyers did, get me behind a paywall. I need to see this article, essentially, and this is what's happened. And another example of that is here, where you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, I think that's GPT-4 has produced or substantially reproduced large parts of a New York Times article, which is shown on the right there. So New York Times is taking them to court. They've also updated the terms and conditions of their website, which is something that Grant touched on as well. And it'll be interesting to see how these cases move through the courts. Another one that's currently on foot, they're Getty Images has sued Stability AI in both Delaware and also in the UK. And this is just an example of one of the images that was in their claim. On the left is the Getty Images image, and on the right is the image that Stability AI reproduced. And you can see that it's a very warped version of that image, but it's still got the Getty Images watermark on it. So there's a trademark infringement claim there as well. I think we're at time, Karen.
We're heading for time, but this is a really good moment, I think, to jump into a couple of questions. If we can, I'll share both the questions with you, because I think they speak to really, I guess, the biggest...
Sorry, Karen, we have a bit of extra time if you want us to.
Fantastic. Yep. I'm just mindful also that we'll try, friends, to finish in the next sort of 5 minutes or so 11:40 Sydney time at the very latest. And of course, it will all be on YouTube. So if you do need to bounce, absolutely fine. Let me just pop into, I think, one of the questions that comes up, it's around text, and then the other one is really around, I suppose, text and images. So the first one is, if I write the original copy and post it into ChatGPT to rewrite to improve accessibility, do I still own the copyright? Yes, no?
Well, I don't want to give you legal advice or a
It's not legal advice.
No, my quick reaction to that would be, if you are using your own content, you're essentially adapting your own content. I think my first reaction is there seems to be a decent chance that the adaptation could be a copyright, but I guess the flip side is that new item, if it's just AI doing it and there's no independent creative effort beyond what AI is doing for the adaptation itself, maybe the answer, the more I think about it, is you could have some issues. So there you go. Isn't that a wishy-washy, unhelpful answer?
I suppose it would, to me, it would depend on what you did with it next, right? Because if it's just sitting on your computer screen, it's not a published item. But if I then publish that, I own it.
Well, you can, I mean, look, if technically there's creative effort and it's sitting on your computer, the copyright kicks into play in Australia as soon as it exists. So, you know, even if you write a paragraph of the book you always wanted to write on a piece of toilet paper, you've got a protected literary work. But so I think the bigger issue is going to be how much creative effort has the person put in to the adaptation.
Yeah. I think also one thing to consider there is which LLM are you using? Which system are you putting it into? So right now, OpenAI's terms and conditions, I believe, say that if you're using just the basic user model, if you're putting it into ChatGPT has a license to use that to train their model, but you still retain the copyright in the input. And if you're using a developer API, there are settings in which you can say, I don't want you to use my content. I'm not actually sure whether they still retain a license to use it for other purposes. I don't think so, but they've given assurance around that. It really would depend on the model from an input perspective, what happens there. And then from an output perspective, look, if it created something substantially different to what you had inputted, I don't think there would be copyright in the output.
It's really interesting. And just on this point, I think some media outlets are building their own in-house LLMs.
Yeah. And yeah.
I do want to go to the next one, which I think you've touched on with this image on the screen there, Grant. Many AI uses prompt engines with in the style of to copy or replicate content style of other creators. Does that open creators to copyright or image use infringements? This is a very live issue at the moment.
So you still have to break it down from a technical point every time. So my quick reactions there, and again, it's going to depend on the circumstances, and I can't avoid that. But if you put it in the style of something, and that style comes as a result of there being a substantial reproduction of someone else's copyright protected works, then yes, I think it's a real risk that what you ultimately produce in itself is consequently a substantial reproduction of something else.
Well, friends, thank you both, all three of you, also very much. First of all, thanks everybody for joining us on the webinar and for sticking around a bit longer. I'll have a recording up fairly soon. I want to thank, in reverse order, our dear friends at News Corp, Grant McAvaney and Antonia Rosen for the copyright and media law section of this session. So thank you so much.
Thank
Pleasure.
you, Corinne.
Thank you for having us.
And thanks, Sam, as well.
And dear Sam, Gregory from Witness, thank you again for preparing such a fascinating and deep and rich webinar for everybody here. Much appreciated.
Glad to participate. Thank you.